Hello everyone, welcome to another edition of EUROCONTROL's Aviation StraightTalk Live. Today we have the great pleasure of widening our horizons, perhaps being less about Europe, more about the international aviation situation more generally, and we couldn't have a better person to talk about that with than the CEO of Qantas Airways, Mr. Alan Joyce. Now, for the interests of full disclosure, I should note that I used to work at Qantas Airways, but never at the same time as Alan in any event. But I would like to look today, if we can, at more general topics, things like what the international aviation situation might look like, what the situation in Asia will look like compared to the situation in Europe, what the situation in Australia looks like compared to the situation in Europe. Australia, of course, significantly larger than Europe, but with a smaller population. So, as ever, in Straight Talk, before we do that, it's my great pleasure to ask the DG of Eurocontrol, Mr. Eamonn Brennan, if he'd set out the current market situation.
Good afternoon from Aviation Straight Talk Live in Brussels. Today we have a very interesting guest, Alan Joyce, the CEO of Qantas, who will give us the view from the long-haul markets and particularly the view from down under and how Australia has handled the COVID crisis and what the outlook for Asia-Pacific region is. A really interesting guest, so welcome, Alan. I really look forward to talking to you as we go on. First of all, the latest developments. It's important to realise that today is Groundhog Day. Groundhog Day in Punxsutawney in Pennsylvania is where the Bill Murray film of 1993, we do the same thing every single day. And sometimes in COVID Europe, it feels like that for us. But to be more serious, last week we had very strong controversies about vaccine approvals, delays and disputes. We had the non-essential ban on travel been strongly discouraged, sometimes an outright ban. And also flights declined by 66% and many airlines only operating 5% of their schedule. Essentially in Europe, we're now looking at cargo operations only. Also, it's worthwhile noting that last week we only had 25% of the seats available for sale that we had 1 year ago. And also 61% of our European aviation fleet is grounded. If we look at the traffic scenarios that we published last week, you can see that we're expecting a really significant decline in traffic. And this is brought about by the uncertainty with the vaccine rollout, but also the uncertainty about the second and third wave of COVID that we're now experiencing. So our projections show basically two scenarios. One, if we get a limited improvement in Q2, and here we would see a pickup, but we are still pretty hopeful for a reasonable resumption of traffic during the summer. So we've not given up on summer holidays in Europe. Also, it's worthwhile noting, and pretty regrettably, that more than half of the world's airline pilots are no longer flying. This is an unprecedented situation. We've never seen this before. Aviation professionals have been furloughed and a lot of aviation industries right throughout the supply chain being in very big trouble. And as the months go on, this situation just becomes worse. But let's have a look at Australia, where Alan is from today. Basically, in 2019, the average flights were 3,300 daily. It dropped 50% in June 2020, but I'm happy to say that they're now operating 65% of the 2019 schedule down under, and that's really significant. But let's just have a look at Qantas. The domestic situation is, they're operating 60% of their schedule from before, and it's still rising, doing pretty well. Alan will talk to you about this. Internationally, effectively, they've stopped passenger operations. They're just operating cargo. And in the future, they've started a very strong 3-year recovery plan. Like others, they have retired the 747-400. And of course, there's the controversy there that Alan will talk to you later on about the requirement to have vaccination certificates to travel. It's worthwhile looking at the Qantas group. You have 11 companies in the Qantas group supplying flights all throughout Australia, long haul, but also many subsidiaries in Asia Pacific. And of course, the very interesting Project Sunrise, which is the ultra long haul travel. So today I welcome Alan Joyce and I give the floor to Andrew to have a very good debate. And next week we look forward to seeing Ben Smith. Thank you very much.
Joyce announced a $2 billion cost-cutting programme. Everything from faster aircraft turnarounds to saving fuel from optimising routes. The workforce shrank by 5,000 or 15%. The fleet was simplified. Qantas dropped unprofitable routes. It was one of the most remarkable aviation turnarounds in history. In 2018, Qantas reported a profit of $1.2 billion US, its largest ever.
Our borders have been closed for a month, and with the ban not expected to lift until late this year at the earliest, hundreds of planes will remain grounded, with our airline industry, for the foreseeable future, shut down.
The collapse of billions of dollars in revenue leaves us with little choice if we are to save as many jobs as possible longer term.
Qantas will slash 20% of its workforce, or a total of 6,000 jobs, as part of a major COVID-19 recovery plan.
The actions that we're taking will have a huge impact on thousands of our people.
15,000 workers will remain stood down for some time, with just over half expected to return to work by the end of the year.
We are looking at changing our terms and conditions to say for international visitors coming out and people leaving the country, we will ask people to have a vaccination before they can get on the aircraft. We think that's a necessity.
Alan, welcome. It's a great pleasure to have you on. It's a great pleasure to be talking to people outside Europe about the situation more globally. Before we get into the more serious questions, Alan, we've just heard from Eamonn. In the last 2 months, I've interviewed 2 other Irish people. You're an Irish person. Is there something in the water in Ireland? What makes aviation such a thing in Ireland?
Well, I think, Andrew, being honest, a lot of us worked for Aer Lingus, which was a great training ground and really got us through the entire spectrum of aviation jobs. I think I had 4 different jobs when I was in Aer Lingus, gave us a good training ground in good management practices and in good aviation knowledge. And a lot of people went on out of the industry. You know, the whole leasing in aviation leasing was really founded from Aer Lingus, Tony Ryan. Ryanair came from him. Low-cost carriers really in Europe started from there. So I think that training ground in Aer Lingus was a great foundation for all of us. And it used to be said, I think, you know, that the Irish, well, went all around the globe. And I think aviation was a particularly important part of that. You know, I think there's so many people here in Australia, as you know, Andrew, as a fellow Australian, that say that they came from Ireland originally. So I think travel, people going around the globe, the Irish diaspora, wherever they are, it's an important part of their lives. And I think it became an important part of what people wanted to be involved in. And Aer Lingus was such a creative company, involved in a lot of things and gave us a great foundation. And I put back my success in the aviation industry to that great training ground.
Right. I mean, it is really stunning, isn't it, that there are just so many points of reference for aviation in Ireland, in global aviation today. It's really an interesting thing to observe.
And maybe it's also a small country. So, we've got the Kiwis next door, and nearly every bank in Australia is run by a Kiwi and a New Zealander who's come across. So the New Zealanders decided to get in banking. The Irish decided to get in aviation. I don't know who's the smartest out of that. Probably the Kiwis, I think. It's probably a better combination.
Don't get me started. Don't get me started. We heard from Eamonn that your Qantas's domestic situation seems to be improving. You're at 60%, I believe, at the moment.
Yes.
Is there a light at the end of the tunnel?
Yes, there is. And for us, probably in Australia, it's probably stronger than most other nations or carriers around the globe. I mean, first of all, Australia's handled COVID-19 probably better than most countries around the globe. We're now back to, we've had one community transmission in the last 2 weeks. We're in a country that's basically back to normal as much as possible. There's some mask wearing, social distancing, but restaurants are functioning, bars are functioning, theatres are functioning, and some parts of the economy are booming here. Retail's booming, the resource sector is booming. So we're seeing a very healthy economy recovering from what COVID-19 did around the globe. Secondly, within that, we are seeing this huge demand for domestic travel when borders open. We still have an issue with borders between our states, but when borders open, we're seeing a big surge of pent-up demand. And as borders have opened, we've seen that across the board. Thirdly, I think for us as a carrier, we're very confident of our strategic position coming out. So our major competitor here in Australia went into voluntary administration. It's coming out a lot smaller. Our major competitor in the low-cost market in Australia, Tiger Air, has gone out of business essentially. So Jetstar has that space. Our Virgin, who was the full-service carrier, is going into the middle of the market. Qantas will have an advantage, I think, in the premium end of the market as a consequence of that. It'll still be very competitive, but Qantas's position is being strengthened. And fourthly, I think what's given me confidence is that we have an action plan to get out of this. Like every airline, we've borrowed to get through COVID, but we've put together a plan that takes $1 billion out of our cost base, 600 million annually this year. That goes to 800 million annually next year and $1 billion the third year. And that will help us, I think, have a fast recovery to repair the balance sheet damage that was done through COVID and get us positioned to take advantage of some of the brilliant opportunities that are out there for us in things like Project Sunrise and things like our domestic fleet replacement that we need to do. So I think, there is light at the end of the tunnel for us, and we're probably in a lot better position than most airlines around the globe.
Yeah, I mean, you've raised a really fascinating array of issues there. Let me start, though, if I can, with the border point. As you say, Australia has done a terrific job in terms of suppressing the virus, but it did that by very early on putting up really quite strict and strong border controls and in the nicest sense, completely killed international aviation for Australia. We haven't seen that in Europe, and we haven't seen that in the United States, for example, until recently. Do you think that was the right call for the community? Leave aside the impact on the airline for a little while, but do you think that was the right call?
Well, you look at the health outcomes of where we are, and I think we've only had but it is still a significant number, 900 deaths caused by COVID-19 in the country. We've seen hundreds of thousands of people dying in Europe and North America. And so the management of the cases that have occurred here and making sure that the health of the population and the people that are vulnerable didn't die from this has been a great success story. Nobody would debate that. I think there's different ways it's been handled in different states. And as you know, we're a federation. And I think the state of New South Wales, where Sydney's based, has handled this phenomenally well. We had an outbreak in Avalon, part of Sydney, just before Christmas. The state didn't close down. The state managed that cluster through tracking and tracing. It managed to keep the cases to less than 20 a day, and then within a couple of weeks got it back to zero. It closed down certain parts of the city, but not all of it, and life continued as normal. Now, we're finding a different approach in other states where there is definitely a view of trying to eliminate the virus and taking zero risk. And I think the way New South Wales has done it is the right balance. It's keeping the economy open, keeping the social aspects of this, because, depriving people from visiting family and friends, destroying jobs as well with the tourism industry has been dramatically hit by this. You have to get that balance right. I think New South Wales is doing it, and we just get frustrated about some of the other states and the approach of zero risk that they do take on this. We even had over Christmas, the Victorian state where Melbourne's based actually lock its own residents out if you had visited Sydney. I couldn't get back home. I don't think we've seen that anywhere else probably in the world. My brother, who lives in Melbourne, couldn't get back home without going into, couldn't literally get back home. It wasn't even allowed until the rules just changed in the last week. So I think I don't think all the time we've got the balance right. I think in New South Wales we have, and it's approaching it in an appropriate way. And we would just encourage and continue to encourage a common system based on the data, based on the science, that every state would apply. The other thing I would say, we have 11 airlines in the Qantas group. This is the equivalent of us having 11 safety managers coming out with different standards and saying what's safe and what isn't safe. That doesn't work that way in aviation. They all sit down together, they agree what's the approach. And unfortunately, at the moment, we still can't get that in a state-by-state process in Australia. They're all different, there's all different rules, and they change all the time. And that's a bit of a nightmare to deal with.
But, speaking from a European perspective, notwithstanding my accent, speaking from a European perspective, first, as you say, only, I'm sure it was a big deal for them, but, 900 deaths, that would be a very good day in most European states at the moment, most European countries. We are now starting to get bored into European border closures, for example. They've had those sorts of border closures between the states in the United States as well. Why do you think Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Korea, why do you think those countries did so well in this and have got to a point of almost being business as usual when in Europe we haven't?
Well, I think the starting point was the international borders, as you said, were closed very early here. It was actually this day a year ago that we had the Chinese operations being closed with notification that was going to be closed in 4 weeks' time. So you'd think how early that was compared to a lot of other countries. And then we did stop all international operations. We grounded our entire international fleet. So that minimised the amount of cases that were coming into the country. And then there was a lockdown for a period of time. We had people just working from home. We had people not encouraged to go out. Restaurants were closed. And then that allowed us to get the infrastructure in place, the testing, to allow us to get things like the critical ICU beds in place for allowing us to be able to manage if it did increase. But that was such a success. It did suppress the virus, got it down to very low levels, and we're now at a stage where it's just about an elimination stage. And at the end, that outcome, I think, has been fantastic. I think everybody here would regard it as a great success story. And as I said, it's had economic benefits. The economy is a lot better than a lot of other countries around the globe, and the speed of coming out of this is there. You can always, in the aviation industry, we're after continuous improvement, and you always can say, can we do things better? And we look at the gold standard of New South Wales and say, yeah, could that be done in other states, even elevate or even higher compared to the rest of the globe? And that's what we would encourage the Australian states to do.
That's very interesting, Alan. One of the things that you have received quite a lot of publicity for globally is your insistence that there be proof of vaccination, no ticket, effectively. Do you think that's the way of the future?
Yeah, I do, for a number of different reasons. I think a lot of governments are already talking about making a requirement for entry into their countries. The Australian Prime Minister has said that either people are going to have to be vaccinated to leave and enter the country or go into 14 days hotel quarantine. And some of our states are saying that they probably won't allow the quarantine option. So it is probably going to be a requirement from governments. And that's not unusual, as we know with yellow fever and polio. Some countries have required that as a condition of entry. We've all had the WHO yellow books for a while. This is probably going to go digital. And IATA is getting itself ready with a digital travel pass that allows for the verification of vaccines and making sure people have a common system around the globe to get used to that. We're going to have to make exceptions for people that have medical conditions where they can't get vaccinated. That's clear. So the detail is going to be always worked through. But then secondly, I think, even if governments weren't to require it, Qantas is regarded as the safest airline in the world. We take that pride in that position. And I think we have a duty of care to our people and to our passengers. And we want to make sure that we're doing everything to ensure their health and safety. And I think there's going to be an important factor on that. And thirdly, when we do market research on it, 89% of our customers saying they think it's an important requirement and fully support it. And I think lastly, I think it's very keen for us to re-energize air travel and bring confidence back to it. And we know an airline cabin is the safest form of transport. There's a lot of protections there. But again, when you do the research and bringing confidence, particularly for long-haul travel back, having a vaccinated cabin where everybody knows everybody else has been vaccinated is actually a big step towards improving confidence and getting people to travel again. And we think also that that's very important. So absolutely, we believe it's probably the way governments are going to go. It's going to be the way countries are going to go. But even if that wasn't the case, I think there's a big case for airlines for the health and safety of its people and for re-establishing the industry to put that in place.
Have you found that other airline CEOs are supporting you with this?
Yeah, I mean, it's different. Some people would rather do a track and tracing or do a testing regime that would be there and think that's the way through it. That's not going to work in Australia because the government has just about eliminated it, and it's either going to be 14 days in hotel quarantine. Testing is not going to reduce that. The Prime Minister here said that last night. So I think vaccination is the only way for us working. But some countries are in a different position. I can understand it. But I've also had other CEOs are saying it's good that Qantas came out there on it and they fully support it, and they're probably going to introduce the same rules. And there's some that will say they think it's a sensible position, but they're going to be relying on the government implementing it and then follow the government rules. So you've got a variation of people with different views out there. I think we've just been honest about it, being forthright about it. That's what you think you're doing when you're the safest airline in the world. You actually talk about why you're promoting that, why that's important. And I think it enhances our brand and our position. And I have no problems with going out there and saying it too.
So how do you see the aviation industry 5 and 10 years from now, given that?
Well, I think there's a lot of, the industry is very hard to predict, as you know. I think my boss, when I first started in Aer Lingus, said one thing you have to get used to is a crisis every 7 years. So I won't be here in 10 years' time because I'm not going to go through the next crisis, Andrew. But I think one of the things I think is going to happen, there's a few things that are going to change in the industry. First, I think it will recover. And I think there will be still huge demand for aviation and transportation. I think it's such an important part of the world economy. And we, like every other crisis that's happened over the last 100 years, Qantas has gone through 100 years. This is 100 years of operation. You do rebound out of it, and it does get to a stage where it grows past that. That'll happen again. I think there will be changes and opportunities for airlines to take advantage. I think the digitization that's happening in other parts of the economy has an opportunity to benefit us. The new distribution capability that IATA has been promoting, that airlines have been moving on, I think is a big change for everybody. Contactless travel, and people now, we're seeing a huge move to that. It's 8 years move in the space of a few months. We think that is a change that will stay there forever. we see opportunities that will present themselves, we think, in ultra-long-haul travel. I think people are less likely to stop off in destinations and hubs. And we were on the path to going through Project Sunrise, which I know we'll probably talk about. But that's an opportunity we think over the next 10 years is pretty huge. And underpinning all of this is the sustainability of the industry. I think the industry in the next 10 years has to move to a lot more sustainable position. We're one of the only airline groups in the world that's committed to be carbon neutral by 2050. We'll have to make a lot more progress in the next decade to position ourselves to meet that target. And I think we can get there, and we believe we can. And I think that would be an exciting thing for the entire industry.
So how are you going to get to carbon neutral? How are you going to get to carbon neutral? Is it all about sustainable fuels?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, initially it will be using carbon offsets, and we've got one of the largest program of carbon offsets in the world. 10% of our customers on Qantas.com offset the carbon emissions. That's compared to 2% in the rest of the industry. So we know our people are very passionate about it, our customers are very passionate about it. And we think that program can grow, and we have a lot of corporates now signing up to it and becoming part of that program instead of just individuals. Secondly, it is sustainable aviation fuel, which is going to take a while to get established, to make it economic, and to get it there as a sustainable, not having other effects. And we just last week signed a deal with BP to work on a plan here in Australia to create a sustainable aviation fuel industry to allow us to get to that target. And BP are pretty excited about it. They think there's a great opportunity. And I think in Australia, we've got massive land mass, we've got massive coastline, and we spend Qantas on its own before COVID-19 was over $4 billion a year on fuel. That's a potential industry that could be a native industry here in Australia. And we have, like everybody else, have tested mustard seed on aircraft, flown them between Melbourne and LA and other sources of sustainable fuels. We think there'll be bets on different technologies to allow us to get there at the end. But we're pretty excited about the opportunity of developing that industry in this country and the opportunity of getting there by 2050.
Right. You also mentioned Project Sunrise, which you were already operating Perth to London non-stop. You're still experimenting or exploring the possibility of Sydney to London non-stop, sort of the ultimate dream. I get the feeling that as you said, a lot of people are going to be more and more interested in the ultra long haul because it saves them having to go through an airport. Do you think that's the way of the future?
Well, absolutely. And, before COVID-19, we had done 3 test flights. I flew on 2 of them, one from New York to Sydney and one from London to Sydney. And we did them in 19 hours, took around 20 minutes on each of them, just the way the winds were blowing. But they were an amazing experience, and we used them as a test research flight to test how our frequent flyers would feel, looking at pilot fatigue issues on it, to see how that would work. So we were taking it unbelievably seriously, and we had designed a product. We had picked an aircraft, the A350-1000. We were literally weeks away from ordering it. We had done the deal with Airbus. The aircraft was capable of doing it. We had designed a product that was designed for ultra long haul. We had done a deal with our pilots. 86% voted in favour of a new enterprise agreement. And so we were planning to order the aircraft and potentially introduce that in 23. Now we've been delayed because of COVID. We had to put that on ice. We still want to revisit it at the end of 21 with the potential of doing it in 24 probably and onwards. But that's the time frame that we think we could get there. And you mentioned the economics on the case before COVID-19 was very strong. Perth-London was the most profitable route on our international network, the longest route on our network. And it had the highest customer satisfaction of any route on our network, believe it or not, being the longest route. And what we discovered is you can design a product. We only had 230 seats on a 787 flying that long sector, deliberately giving extra seat space, deliberately making them more premium seats on board the aircraft. And the same was planned for the 350, even more so, because you could have flights up to 21 hours operating on it. And when you think it is a unique opportunity a bit for Qantas, because Australia is so far away from everywhere, we could justify a fleet size of a significant amount of aircraft that makes it economic. Where if you're a BA or a Lufthansa, probably the only place you need the aircraft for is Australia, which is 2 or 3 aircraft. Or an American Airlines, it's probably New York to Australia. And you're never going to go for a sub-fleet of that size for these ultra-long-haul flights. Where Qantas needs it, we have 3 major cities on the East Coast, Brisbane, Sydney and Melbourne, and having flights to London, to Frankfurt, to Paris, to New York, to Chicago, to Rio de Janeiro, to Cape Town, from those cities creates a significant sub-fleet and economics and scale that we think will work really well. So we're still very keen on it, and we think that's one of the big things that will change in the next decade and allow us to have a sustainable competitive advantage that nobody else is probably going to introduce.
So the tyranny of distance finally works in Australia's favour.
Well, as an ex-employee of Qantas, you know that our founder, Hudson Fysh, said when he founded Qantas, it was there to overcome the tyranny of distance. That's why he had his division. And I think he'd be pretty proud 100 years later that the ultimate tyranny of distance, the longest routes in the world, the only city pairs that really are missing from the world's map, will be introduced when we introduce these aircraft, which I think is fantastic.
Talking about aircraft, Qantas went long into the A380 as well. Do you think there's any markets left that will sustain a 500-seat aeroplane?
Yeah, we do. I mean, we've written down the aircraft now a couple of times. The last one was last year as a result of COVID-19, and we've parked the aircraft for at least 3 years in the United States. All 12 of them are sitting in the Mojave Desert, and it's a heartbreaking sight to see them sitting there. But we had reconfigured 6 of them with brand new product on board. In fact, one aircraft just being reconfigured in Dresden flew directly to the Mojave Desert. And it's there with new seats on it and nobody's ever sat on, which is unbelievably disappointing. But we do think if you look at the Qantas network, there are going to be opportunities to deploy those aircraft. We do have scheduling windows, if you remember, Andrew, because if you've ever been in LA between 10 o'clock and midnight, you see 6 or 7 Qantas aircraft departing to Australia because it's the only time that works with curfews. So instead of flying multiple frequencies right on top of each other, an A380 that's fully or nearly fully written down, if it generates cash, will absolutely work. Airports that have slot restrictions like Heathrow, a slot in Heathrow is extremely expensive. The aircraft works for that, and the similar scheduling windows that work to Australia that are unique. So we do believe there's a need for that fleet, and we do believe that it will generate cash, and it's all going to be about cash when we start up international. And eventually, over time, hopefully we'll have enough of the 350 aircraft to fly direct and overfly a lot of the hubs as well, that will take the burden of having the big aircraft needed for those big destinations.
Looking perhaps more broadly, do you think that there's any chance of any consolidation in the industry as we come out of the COVID crisis?
Well, the industry is going to be pretty weak post this. I think IATA's forecast last year was that there's already debt in the aviation industry is going to increase from $430 billion US dollars to $650 billion US dollars. So that's a huge increase in debt. And I think last June they said that the median airline had 9 months of cash, which takes them to this quarter. And that's the median. So half the world's airlines are going to run out of cash unless there's more debt or more government support. And Pierre Harbison of CAPA thinks that up to 40% of the world's airlines could go bankrupt. Now, it's hard to predict which ones, and sometimes this takes a while to play out. But I think in that environment, there will be survivors, there will be people that won't make it, and there will be airlines that will consolidate to survive as well. So I think there will be a lot of opportunities, and there may need to be, in order for the industry to get through this. but it's a watching brief, because who knows what level of government interference, support, what level of debt people can raise to get through it. I'm hopeful at the end of it. I mean, I think you will see the quality airlines really thriving out of this, the likes of Qantas. I think we went into this with a strong balance sheet, strong financial discipline. We were in a position where we were able to raise equity during this crisis, $1.5 billion, able to raise a lot of debt. We're one of a handful of airlines that are investment grade left in the world. So the debt markets are still open to us. We just raised extra debt just before Christmas. So given that, hopefully the quality airlines will shine through and will perform exceptionally well in this post-COVID-19 world.
One of the things that Qantas has done extremely well, I think, is having its own in-house low-cost carrier in the shape of Jetstar. And indeed, you started at Qantas in the Jetstar side of the operation. Most airlines struggle to have an in-house low-cost carrier, so we've seen independent low-cost carriers grow up. What's the secret at Qantas, do you think, of allowing that to be the case?
Well, when we started Jetstar back in 2003, and that was my task back then, to have a team and get a team together to set up a low-cost carrier. And what we did, like approach any good business investigation, we looked at what were the type of failures and why did people fail? And we came up with what we called the schizophrenic nature to having a low-cost carrier, because we saw one set of failures that when the airlines became too independent. And I think Rod Eddington talked about Go Airlines, and he actually said that the cure was worse than the disease, because they owned it, but it became very competitive against British Airways and actually caused them a lot of issues. Then there was the whole series of other failures when it was too close to the legacy carrier. You had TED by United, Song by Delta. I mean, it had no difference in the employee arrangements. It had the same overheads and infrastructure that was supporting it, just different brands essentially, and weren't really true low-cost carriers. So what we decided is that it had to be real, very different. Jeff Dixon, who was running Qantas at the time, said you can't be based in Sydney, set it up somewhere else. You can pick any other city, so you'd have the separation. So we did. And we did everything independent pilots, cabin crew, independent supply of ground handling, engineering, everything. And it came under Virgin by 5% in cost base, which was our target. Now, Jetstar's 30% lower cost base than its major competitor here, which is amazing when you think that the rest of the world went the opposite way. You know, there was no way that the rest of the legacy carriers were able to set up a low-cost carrier that was that efficient against the other low-cost carrier in the market. And then what we decided to do to stop the cure becoming worse than the disease, we coordinated a lot and made sure the brands were very differently on the network and on pricing and revenue management. But what that meant at the start is there were two separate route networks, a Qantas network and a Jetstar network, because we with potential cannibalization. Today, again before COVID-19, there were 40 routes where both carriers are on it, and they appeal to different segments of the markets because the brands evolved and developed very differently. And you could, Melbourne-Sydney, the second largest city pair in the world, Qantas had over 35 flights a day, Jetstar nearly 15 flights a day for COVID-19. Jetstar could be offering $39 airfares, and the lowest airfare in Qantas be $139. And the market will pay for that and support that. And the premium brand went up market and thrived. And at the end of the day, what happened? Qantas Domestic became the most profitable business in our network because it elevated the brand, the product. Jetstar, unbelievably profitable, but still number two to Qantas Domestic. And the combination of them caused chaos to our major competitor, who couldn't figure out which market they were in, tried to move up market, go after Qantas, failed there, went bankrupt essentially, and now have decided to move back into the middle of the market to be somewhere between the two brands. We like that competitive positioning, and we think we'll do quite well.
And you've exported the Jetstar model as well into Asia, perhaps looking beyond Australia to Asia. How do you see the Asian market developing? And do you see a role for Jetstar Asia in that?
Yes, pretty strongly. We're partnering up. So in Japan, it's the next biggest Jetstar business, Jetstar Japan. And what we were able to do is use our partnerships. We have a long-term partnership with JAL to actually have a joint venture there and to bring our knowledge and understanding of having a low-cost carrier working with a full-service carrier, bring that expertise. And that's been a great success story in the Japanese market. Again, before COVID-19, Jetstar Japan was the largest domestic low-cost carrier and was aiding the JAL group in their objectives up in that market. So we're very optimistic about the growth projections there. We think Jetstar Japan could be as big, if not bigger, than Jetstar Australia eventually. And then Jetstar Singapore has been a great feeding airline for Qantas into Singapore, which is a big hub, and the other One World partners and other partners in Singapore that need something to balance up the Singapore Airlines group. And that's provided a very good point-to-point market, but impressively, for a low-cost carrier, a very good connecting market that's helped support a lot of our partners in the Singapore area. So we're very optimistic about the opportunities. The brand is really good in Asia. I think Jetstar Japan appeared in the top 100 foreign brands up there. It was ahead of a lot of well-known American brands. It's seen as a Japanese brand. It's actually penetrated the market exceptionally well, and we're very happy with its positioning there.
Right. Do you see, you mentioned One World there. How do you see the airline groupings after COVID? Do you think that the alliances will continue in much the same way?
Well, as chairman of One World, I'd have to say yes, wouldn't I, automatically? But no, I actually am a big believer in One World. I think it, and those alliances do work. We've been a very supportive member, a founding member of One World. And we think a lot of our big partnerships work really well there. And a lot of our customers like the One World relationships. But it's not only, One World, I think it's got its model right. It's not an exclusive club where you can't deal with people outside of it. And we have these amazing relationships outside of One World. We have Emirates with our joint venture there that really changed our whole European operation. It's been a very successful partnership. It's now gone for nearly 8 years. Both Emirates and Qantas are exceptionally happy with how that was performing before COVID-19. We have a codeshare deal with Air New Zealand. We have now LATAM is out of One World. We have a partnership with LATAM, which will continue. We have a partnership with China Eastern. And then we have these big joint ventures. And I think the joint ventures, to me, are also more important than the global alliance. The Emirates venture, the American Airlines joint venture, the China Eastern joint venture, and we're applying for the JAL joint venture that allow us to recover the Japanese market. Those joint businesses really engage partners even more so. And I think in order for aviation to recover post COVID-19, we're going to need to see more of them. And we're going to need the airlines to be able to work together to encourage people to travel together and use their respective strengths in each of their home markets to get that travel moving again.
The market traditionally is VFR, leisure and business. Have you, and the prediction around here certainly is that the business market will be the slowest of those three to recover. Is that your experience in Australia where business is getting back to normal?
No, but there's a few unique positions here that make this a little bit different from other markets. A huge proportion of our business customers are fly in, fly out. We have these resource sectors in Western Australia and Queensland, and that market didn't take much of a decline during COVID, and we're seeing huge investment and growth given where commodity prices are. So we think that's a growth area. We've also seen a lot of government activity, which I think we will see post the recovery on COVID. And we're still seeing the next few months are critical about the other parts of the economy, the financial services, the professional services starting back again. So that we have to see what happens. Now, we do expect that because of Zoom, because of Microsoft Teams, there will be a bit of shrinkage in what people were traveling for. But we think the personal contacts, the sales contacts, and people seeing their teams, the research we've done, there's still a huge proportion of business traffic that's needed for that. And also because of our major competitor changing its model, we're seeing or believing our share will go up of particularly that corporate market. We've already, in the last 6 months, seen 25 major corporate accounts move back to Qantas from the competition. So we think also we'll see a market share shift that will replace some of the shrinkage because of technology. So we're still optimistic about Qantas's recovery and Qantas's ability to actually generate the returns that it had before COVID-19, even with all of those technology changes. But you're right, the big pent-up demand is VFR, the big pent-up demand is leisure, and anytime we see a new route opening up that people can travel on, we're seeing huge surges in demand. Jetstar before Christmas did a $19 promotional sale. It had 220 bookings a minute. It's the biggest sale in Jetstar's history. And we did a travel for a return for free. And that was nearly 8 times normally what we would have sold in the same period in the prior year. So we know that VFR, holiday traffic, there's a huge pent-up demand for it. And when borders open up, it does come back very rapidly.
How important to Qantas's model is the international and domestic balance? Qantas started, of course, as an international-only airline and then had to develop a domestic airline by acquiring Australian. But once upon a time, Qantas had a dominant share of the international outbound market. Now it's around, pre-COVID, was around about 25%. Do you think there's a base on its international travel that it can't afford to go below?
Well, it's interesting. When you break down that 25%, we have the strength where we need the strength. Qantas's international market is really focused on where the corporate market wants to go to. Qantas makes it's a premium airline, it makes a lot of money out of business, first class, premium economy. And if you look at the top 20 destinations in the world where the business traveler wants to go, Qantas flies most of them. London, LA, and has a big presence on those markets and a big share of the corporate market. Shanghai, I can go through them all in the region. And where Qantas is weak are markets like the Chinese inbound market, which is low-yielding leisure. And we work extensively with our partner, China Eastern, to meet that market requirements. Or continental Europe, where essentially it's very hard to compete against the hub carriers, but we work closely with Emirates. So you don't see within those share numbers what the partnership generates in giving people an option to get to those locations. And the combination that Qantas have is very important. International is very much aspiration for a lot of our leisure customers. They want the holiday to London or to LA. They want the upgrade to business or first. So it's also a big driver of our loyalty program. And if you look at Qantas's profitability, most of it is made domestically. We nearly made $1 billion before COVID-19 domestically. We made $400 million on Qantas loyalty, which is selling points to the banks. Amazing stat, 36% of all credit card expenditure in Australia is on a Qantas earning credit card.
Goodness me.
I don't think any other airline in the world would have that in the home market. So we make a lot of money out of that. But the aspiration for all of that keeps those corporate accounts, keeps people traveling with you, is having this extensive international network. So rebuilding it post-COVID-19 is a priority. Project Sunrise enhances that dramatically and allows us to have a profit pool there that we think was going to be quite good and aids our domestic and loyalty businesses as a network business, which is where we make most of our money. So we don't need to have 50% market share. We just need to have the market share on the markets that are really important, which we do, and we will recover that very well post-COVID-19.
Do you see a Jetstar China at any time in the future?
I think Jetstar's opportunities, you never know when they can come up. I think the difficulty in China is that you're probably not going to get a franchise arrangement like you have with Jetstar, given the protections the Chinese carriers have. one of the things I've always said, which is fascinating, is how complicated it is to set up airlines, except for Australia. Australia, you can set up an airline here and have 100% ownership. Virgin is 100% owned by Bain Capital. We've got Rex Airlines, who are owned in the vast majority by Singaporeans. Yet, when we look at trying to set up airlines in Japan, we can only own 33% of the equity. In the US, if we were to do it, 25% of the voting rights. And then I think similar restrictions in all of these major markets. So we've learned to cope with extensive open competition, but there's still restrictions on what you can do in various countries in this region, which puts a limitation on some of the expansion you'd like to do.
Any hope that we might finally liberalise the Chicago Convention?
Well, you know, we've been talking about ASEAN open skies now for decades. It keeps getting pushed off. So hopefully we'll get there one day. You've done it in Europe. When I worked in Aer Lingus, it was just starting in 1988. I remember Aer Lingus starting its Manchester to Europe strategy, preempting the liberalisation in Europe, lost a lot of money on it because there was still restrictions. And then Ryanair took advantage at the perfect time out of Stansted and became the powerhouse it is in Europe. So those opportunities could be there. And when they are there, you need to grab them, and we'll be able to grab them with Qantas and Jetstar. I've always said the one thing I'd love is a magic wand that says all the traffic bilaterals just disappear. Qantas can fly anywhere. We let any airline fly here. We would do really well out of it, given our brand, given our consistency, given our history, and given our product. So we're not scared of competition. We've lived with it for a long time, but we just want equal rights when rights are given away in the Australian market.
Right. So, Alan, we've almost run out of time. The question I always end with, and your international perspective, I think, will be really interesting on this, but what role does Eurocontrol play? What role can Eurocontrol play to build international aviation back better?
Well, I think one, to continue doing what you're doing, it would be an advice for reform for the aviation industry, for transportation. And I think Eamonn Brennan, I think, is seen as a legend in the industry. He does a great job out there, and he needs to continue doing what he does. He speaks from the heart, he speaks honestly, and I think that's great. I'd also say, there are things that the industry is going to need advocacy and help for. It's going to be an uneven recovery, with some markets being better than others, markets being open and faster than others. So since when it comes to slot restrictions, since when it comes to charging, one of the things we have to be conscious of, we're probably going to have low volumes with some very expensive infrastructure over them. So how do we make sure that that infrastructure doesn't kill air traffic control charges? Doesn't kill the recovery of the aviation industry as well. And Eurocontrol, I think, has a big, important role to play on making sure that's done in a sensible way. And then advocacy like this, talking about the issues, sustainability, making sure that the industry continues to develop a sustainable future and promoting that. So continue doing what you're doing and more of it, and recognising as we get through this recovery, it's going to be uneven. And it's going to need help, and it's going to need voices like Eurocontrol to actually speak up for it.
Thanks very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure you'll agree with me that was a really fascinating look at absolutely international aviation in the future, what the sort of market variations are going to be, completely engrossing. And I'd like to thank you, Alan, very much for your time today to do that. Let me finish just by noting that our next Straight Talk is going to be on the 23rd of February, and it is with Mr. Ben Smith, who is the CEO of Air France, who no doubt has a slightly different view. We then go to Canada and Mr. Ed Sims from WestJet, and then, of course, a low-cost carrier view with Johan Lundrum. But let me thank Alan Joyce one more time and thank you for your company, and I look forward to seeing you again.